Chapter 13, Section 1 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 13, The Principate of Tiberius, continued, 14 to 37 A.D. Section 1. Civil government of Tiberius. As the reign of Tiberius was singularly exempt from wars, the emperor was able to devote his undivided attention to domestic government and the welfare of his subjects. His policy was distinguished by a conservative spirit. The chief principle of his administration was to follow the lines marked out by his predecessor. By abandoning the practice, which Augustus had adopted, of receiving an investiture of supreme power for a limited period only, he made a step nearer undisguised monarchy. The Decennalia, or feast in honour of the decennial renewal of the tribunician power of the emperor, survived as a mere custom, without any political meaning. In two important matters he went beyond Augustus in emphasizing the diarchy and excluding the people from the government. 1. The functions which Augustus had left to the comitia of the people, in electing magistrates, were taken away by Tiberius, and transferred to the senate soon after his accession. The only part left to the people was to acclaim those whom the senate chose. Tiberius preserved the imperial rights of nomination and commendation of candidates within the limits marked out by his father. 2. The people did not formally lose its sovereign right of legislation, but since the time of Tiberius it actually ceased to legislate. For the emperor and the magistrates ceased to bring leges before the comitia. There are only 2 instances of such leges in the reign of Tiberius, while there are numerous senatus consulta. The later emperors, Claudius and Nerva, temporarily revived the old practice, but with these exceptions it may be said that, from Tiberius forward, legislation consisted of the consulta of the senate and the rescripts of the emperor. The only legislative purpose for which the people had any longer to meet in comitia was to transfer the tribunician power on a new Princeps. Another important matter, in which Tiberius carried further an idea originated by Augustus, was the establishment of a permanent prefecture of the city of Rome. We have seen that this office had been instituted as a temporary provision for the care of the city during absences of the emperor, and Lucius Calpurnius Piso had been appointed prefect when Augustus left Rome in 14 A.D. Tiberius made the office a permanent post of great dignity, only open to senators of consular rank. He placed the 3 cohortes urbanis at the disposal of the prefect, and thus deprived the senate of the police control of the city. The prefect had a criminal court, in which he administered summary justice in the case of slaves and roughs. Piso held the office for nearly 20 years, till his death in 32 A.D. Tiberius also instituted a new official of consular rank to look after the banks of the Tiber, cura riparum et alveae Tiberis, in addition to the cura aquarum, which had been founded by Augustus. Tiberius concerned himself for the improvement of the civil service. One great defect of the prevalent system was that offices were filled by inexperienced young men, who held them for only a brief time. Tiberius tried to remedy this by extending the period of tenure, and men began to complain that they grew old in the discharge of the same duties. He did not attempt to introduce this innovation in the case of the magistrates appointed by the senate, and this was a sign that he was in earnest with the maintaining of the imperial system of Augustus, by which the senate had its sphere of activity independent of the emperor. And when the proposal came from that body, in 22 A.D., that the emperor should test the qualifications of senatorial magistrates, Tiberius rejected it. He always behaved with studied politeness to senators, and he was accustomed to refer to the senate matters which might more naturally have come before himself. Like Augustus, he employed a consilium, which consisted of his personal advisers and 20 illustrious members of the senatorial and equestrian orders. But it does not appear that this cabinet council had any real influence in political affairs. Tiberius was curiously reserved in avoiding the assertion of his sovran power by titles and outward forms. In affecting to disguise his imperial position he went much further than Augustus. He never bore the praenomen Imperator, and called himself Augustus only when he was corresponding with foreign princes. He refused the title Pater Patriae, and forbade all, except his slaves, to address him as Dominus. He did not permit temples or statues to be erected to himself, and he rejected the proposal to consecrate his mother, Livia Augusta. In the army he maintained strict discipline. He declined to fulfil the promises of higher pav which had been made to the mutineers in Illyricum and on the Rhine after his accession, and instead of shortening the period of service, he actually lengthened it. These facts indicate the strength of his authority with the troops. He took away from victorious generals the privilege of bearing the title Imperator, and reserved it for members of the imperial family. In regard to the praetorian guards, he made an innovation, which has an important bearing on the future course of Roman history. Augustus had allowed only 3 cohorts to be quartered within the city, the other 6 being dispersed in the neighbourhood of Rome. Tiberius caused a permanent camp to be built in front of the Porta Viminalis (23 A.D.), and henceforward all the 9 cohorts were stationed there together. Thus united, they were conscious of their numbers and felt their power, and at many a crisis they disposed of the empire and elected emperors. This step also increased considerably the political power of the praetorian prefect. In fact, the idea seems to have emanated from the favourite counsellor of Tiberius, L. Aelius Sejanus, whom he had appointed praetorian prefect, and who saw how his own position would be strengthened by a concentration of the forces under his command. The financial policy of Tiberius was careful and successful. The expenses of supplying Rome with corn and feeding the populace grew larger in his reign than they had been under Augustus. But in spite of this Tiberius was so economical that he was always able to act liberally in special emergencies. He did not waste the funds of the state in donatives or costly buildings. The only public edifices built by his command were the Temple of Augustus and the Theatre of Pompey. But when many of the famous cities of Asia were laid in ruins by an earthquake, Tiberius succoured them with the princely gift of 10,000,000 sesterces (£80,000), and caused the senate to remit to the inhabitants the payment of their tribute for 5 years. He had himself to supply the deficiency in the aerarium. We find him, in 33 A.D., bestowing on that treasury 100,000,000 sesterces (£800,000), and in 36 A.D. he gave the same sum for the relief of the sufferers in a great conflagration on the Aventine hill. He never raised the rate of taxation. When Cappadocia became a province, on the strength of the addition which thus accrued to the revenue he reduced the tax of 1% on the sale of goods to 0.5%. The liberality of Tiberius in coming to the relief of the provinces, in the case of disasters, introduced a new principle into Roman statesmanship. Men were beginning to see that Rome, the mistress, had duties towards her subject lands. This policy of Tiberius is, as has been observed, one of the first signs of the reaction of the provinces upon Rome. It was, indeed, in the exercise of his proconsular functions that Tiberius most conspicuously showed himself as a wise and large-minded statesman. If he was hated at Rome, he was loved in the provinces. There is ample testimony to prove that his reign was, to the subjects, a period of unusual happiness. The discipline of the troops was strictly maintained, and the control exercised over the conduct of the governors was efficient and severe. The means of obtaining justice against oppression were facilitated, and under no reign were there so many prosecutions of governors and procurators for extortion. Besides this, the burdens were never increased, and the new principle of keeping the same governor at his post for a long time seems to have worked satisfactorily. See Pompeius Sabinus, legatus of Macedonia and Achaia, which Tiberius had united in a single imperial province (15 A.D.), held that office throughout almost the whole reign. The imperial provinces were, as a rule, more equitably ruled than the senatorial. This is shown clearly under Tiberius by the number of cases in which proconsuls were condemned for maladministration. The subjects themselves considered it a piece of good fortune to be transferred from the government of the senate to that of the Emperor. Tiberius expressed his provincial policy in saying that "it is the part of a good shepherd to shear his sheep, not to flay them." The especial regulation which made the governors responsible for acts of rapacity on the part of their wives deserves notice. If he cared for the provinces, Tiberius did not neglect to help and guide the senate in promoting the welfare of Italy. He provided for the public safety and the security of travellers against robbers by stationing troops in various parts of the country, and all disturbances were promptly suppressed. He also concerned himself for the revival of agriculture, which had been slowly and surely declining in Italy during the past century, owing to the disappearance of the population of free labourers, so that the peninsula was dependent on foreign supplies for her maintenance. A serious economic crisis occurred in 33 A.D., and the Emperor was obliged to interpose in order to save credit. The professional accusers, delatores, made an attack upon the money-lending capitalists, who had been systematically acting in defiance of two laws of Julius Caesar. One of these laws forbade any one to have more than 60,000 sesterces £480 of ready money in hand. The rest of each man's property was to be invested in lands and houses in Italy. The other regulated the relations between the lenders and borrowers, and the amount of interest. The matter came before the city praetor Gracchus, who thought it necessary to refer the question to the senate, as so many people were concerned. But the senators themselves were all guilty of transgressing the law, and so they appealed to the Emperor. He granted a year and 6 months, within which term every one was to arrange his accounts in conformity with the law. The usurers immediately called in their loans, and a large number of the debtors, in order to meet their obligations, were obliged to sell their estates. It was foreseen that this would lead to a scarcity of money, and, in order to keep specie in circulation, a senatus consultum in the spirit of Caesar's law was passed, that every creditor should have at least 2/3 of his capital invested in estates in Italy. But the remedy proved only an aggravation of the evil, for the creditors hoarded up their money to buy land cheap, and the value of estates fell so much that the debtors could not pay their debts. Many families were ruined. But at length Tiberius came to their rescue, and advanced 100,000,000 sesterces as a loan fund, from which any debtor might borrow, for 3 years without interest, on giving security to the state for double the amount. By this means credit was restored, and the remaining debtors were enabled to save their estates or get the legitimate value for them. Tiberius paid special and minute attention to the administration of justice. He introduced a new and salutary regulation, that 9 days should intervene between the sentence and its execution, in the case of culprits condemned by the senate. That body became, in his reign, the High Court of Criminal Justice. But the Emperor exercised paramount control over its decisions, and in all cases which affected his own interest, the senate merely expressed what they knew to be his will. In legislation Tiberius was also active. The Lex Junia Norbana, 19 A.D., was a measure to protect such freedmen as had not been strictly emancipated, but were released from slavery by their masters. This law rendered them independent of their masters for life, and gave them commercium without connubium, or, as it was called, juniana latinitas. They could neither bequeath property by will, nor receive bequests from others. The equestrian class was also limited by a senatus consultum, which excluded those whose grandfathers were not freeborn, and who did not possess a fortune of 400,000 sesterces £32,000. In his endeavours to reform abuses and suppress nuisances in Rome and Italy, the Emperor increased and confirmed his unpopularity. He limited the number of gladiators in the arena, and on the occasion of a riot in the theatre, he expelled the players from the city. He made a vain attempt to banish soothsayers from Italy. He tried to suppress the Oriental rites, which were making themselves a home in Rome. He forbade especially the worship of Isis, and cast her statue into the river. He also adopted severe measures against Jews, who possessed Roman citizenship in Italy. They had attempted to evade military service, and on this ground were regarded as bad subjects, and their rights were forbidden. 4,000 Jew freedmen were transported to Sardinia, and set the task of reducing the robbers who infested that unhealthy island. The limitation of the right of asylum may also be mentioned here, though it chiefly affected the eastern part of the Empire, where many places of refuge had been established for the protection of criminals. These religious refuges secured immunity to crime, and they had become public nuisances. Tiberius could do little to combat the prevailing luxury and dissipation among the higher classes. Frugal and moderate himself, he deeply disapproved of the extravagance of the aristocracy, and the absurd sums which were spent on furniture and the luxuries of the table. But he saw clearly that sumptuary laws were futile, and he said publicly that the time was not fit for a censorship. He was careful to keep up the state religion which Augustus had revived. His mother Livia sat in public among the Vestal Virgins, and the priests of the newly founded college of the Sodales Augustales, who were to preserve the worship of the divine Augustus, consisted of the leading senators. The part of the policy of Tiberius which perhaps did the most to render him disliked by both contemporaries and posterity was the new interpretation which he gave to maiestas. This crime was properly an offence against the abstract majesty of the commonwealth, and it came to include anything tending to bring the state into contempt. A lex Julia of Caesar had defined strictly the various forms which the maiestas might assume, and had been extended by Augustus, who, however, had made little use of it. But Tiberius seized on the law of maiestas as a means for his own security, and under him treason became an offence against the person of the Emperor, who thus comes to be regarded as the state. Any insult offered to the Princeps in either speech or writing was brought under the head of maiestas. Tiberius did not deem himself safe against treachery, and he decided to resort to this engine, which could not fail to be abused and bring odium upon him. It was an instrument by the fear of which he hoped to control the senators, and prevent them from expressing a dissentient view, lest it should be construed as treason. The case of Lutorius Priscus shows how outrageously his safeguard could be abused. Priscus was a knight who had written verses on the death of Germanicus, and had received from Tiberius a gift as a reward. Some time later Drusus fell ill, and Priscus, encouraged by his former success, composed a poem on Drusus to be published in case the prince should not recover. But though Drusus did not die, the poet could not resist the pleasure of reading his composition to an audience, and the consequence was that the matter became known, and he was accused before the senate. The senate found him guilty of counting on the death of a Caesar. Only 2 senators proposed that he should be leniently dealt with, as his act was due to thoughtlessness, not to evil intent. But he was condemned to death, and the sentence was forthwith carried out. Tiberius was absent from Rome when this happened, and when he returned he regretted the occurrence, and praised the view of the small minority. The affair of Priscus led to the regulation already mentioned, that a delay should intervene between the sentence and the infliction of punishment. The evils of this unhappy extension of the scope of maiestas were aggravated by the encouragement which was given by Tiberius to the delatores. Originally the delator was one who apprised the officers of the exchequer of debts that were due to the senate. The name was extended to those who informed in the cases of offences which were subject to fines. Augustus encouraged delation by offering rewards to those who lodged information against the violators of his marriage laws. Delation soon became a regular profession, and as there was no public prosecutor, it was very convenient to the government to have prosecutions conducted by private delators. When Tiberius came to the throne, he regarded delation as an admirable instrument for securing the administration and enforcement of justice, and therefore encouraged it. But when he discovered how terribly it was abused and how odious it was to his subjects, he concluded that it was too dangerous a remedy, and set himself to check it, for he was honestly anxious to administer justice purely and strictly. The citizens lived in fear and terror of the unscrupulous informers, and Tiberius tried to hinder the distortion of the laws by instituting a tribunal of 15 senators. But he relapsed afterwards into countenancing the practice of delation, owing to the influences of the praetorian prefect Sejanus, and as the law of treason became more comprehensive and extravagant, the delators became more terrible. Chapter 13, Section 1.